The morning I found 45 people setting up tents on the eastern section of my property. I was coming back from my pre-dawn water check on the swamp edge with mud on my boots and a flashlight in my hand, and the particular alertness of someone who had been managing a wetland property in central Florida for 14 years and knew exactly what lived in it, and where it lived, and what time of morning it was most active. I counted the tents as I came through the tree line. 11 tents, folding chairs, a portable camp kitchen being assembled near the cypress cluster, a fire ring being built from stones that someone had carried from my gravel access road, children running between the tents in the gray pre-dawn light, adults in camping gear drinking coffee from thermoses with the relaxed energy of people who believed they were exactly where they were supposed to be. They were not where they were supposed to be. They were on my land. Approximately 40 yards behind the furthest tent, in the dark water of the swamp edge, where the cypress knees came up through the black surface, and the morning mist sat low and still, there were 11 American alligators that I had documented in my most recent survey, ranging from 4 feet to 9 feet 2 inches, and which were most active in the low-light hours of early morning and late evening. It was 5:47 in the morning. I turned off my flashlight. I stood at the tree line for a moment and thought about the specific combination of what I was looking at and what was behind it. Then I moved. Not toward the tents, toward the swamp edge first, because the priority was not the camper's inconvenience. The priority was the 9'2" alligator named Goliath, who had been resident in the cypress section for 7 years, and who I had learned over those 7 years was curious about new activity near his territory in ways that required management. I found Goliath 12 yards from the nearest tent. He was on the bank in the mist, motionless, which is how alligators are when they are paying attention to something. He was paying attention to the camp kitchen being assembled 40 yards away. I placed myself between Goliath and the camp, made the noise I had learned over 7 years he associated with my presence, and watched him make his assessment. After 45 seconds, he slid backward into the water with the specific unhurried efficiency of an apex predator that has decided to wait rather than engage. I watched the water surface settle. Then I walked to the nearest adult camper, a man in his 50s in a bright orange jacket who was pouring coffee from a thermos, and I said very quietly, because I did not want to create a panic-driven situation near an active wetland at dawn, "Sir, I need everyone to move away from the water edge immediately and gather near the access road. There is an alligator situation, and I need to address it before anyone gets closer to the swamp." The man in the orange jacket looked at me. He looked at my mud-covered boots. He looked at the swamp edge where the mist was sitting. He said, "Are you serious?" I said I was completely serious, and that I needed everyone to move now, and that I would explain the full situation once everyone was in a safer location. He moved, he was good about it, which I appreciated, and within 4 minutes, he and 3 other adults had gathered the group, including the children, and moved them toward the access road at the north end of the eastern section, away from the water. I spent 20 minutes at the swamp edge after that. Goliath was back on the bank within 8 minutes of the group moving. He settled in the same position, monitoring, and after a while seemed to determine that whatever had been interesting was no longer interesting in the same way. He returned to the water on his own. The other 10 residents of the swamp edge had not moved toward the camp at all, which told me the noise and activity had registered as something to avoid rather than approach. That was a manageable situation. I walked to the access road where 45 campers were standing in a loose cluster, looking at me with a range of expressions that ran from confused to worried to the specific look of people who had been told they were going somewhere fun and were recalibrating. I said, "Good morning. My name is Thomas Greer. You are on my property. I need to know who organized this camping event, and I need to know right now." A woman near the front of the group, mid-40s, wearing a Pinewood Lakes HOA Community Coordinator lanyard, said, "I'm Diane Mellows. I coordinate events for the Pinewood Lakes HOA. We were told this land was available for our fall camping weekend. I said, "Who told you that?" She said, "Our HOA president, Warren Gill. He arranged the land access." I said, "Warren Gill does not have the authority to arrange access to my land. This is private property. You are trespassing." She stared at me. I said, "More importantly, the eastern section of my property borders an active alligator habitat. I counted 11 individuals in the swamp edge this morning, including one 9-foot animal that was within 40 yards of your nearest tent at 5:47. I need you to understand what I am telling you." Diane Mellows was quiet for a moment. Then she said, very carefully, "There are alligators." I said, "There are always alligators. I manage this wetland. I know where they are and what they do. You were setting up camp 40 yards from the most active section of the swamp at the time of morning when alligators are most active." She put her hand over her mouth. I gave her a moment. Then I said, "Is anyone hurt?" She said no. I said, "Is everyone accounted for?" She said yes, she had a group list. I said I needed her to confirm the count. She counted 45, all present. I said, "Good. I need everyone to remain on the access road while I make some calls and determine how we are going to handle this." I stepped away and called my attorney. Then I called Warren Gill. "My name is Thomas Greer. I am 56 years old, licensed wetland ecologist, and owner of a 68-acre property on the northern edge of Osceola County, Florida, that I purchased 14 years ago specifically for its ecological value. The property has upland pine sections, transitional scrub, and approximately 18 acres of cypress swamp and wetland margin that I have managed as a private conservation area under a voluntary conservation easement with the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. The easement gives me certain tax benefits in exchange for maintaining the wetland in its natural state and following management protocols that include regular wildlife surveys, water quality monitoring, and the specific alligator management program I had been running for 7 years. The alligator management program was not a removal program. I want to be clear about that because it matters to the story. I did not trap and relocate alligators from my property. I managed human activity near the alligator habitat to prevent conflict. This meant I knew where every resident animal was, approximately, at any given time. I had documented 11 individuals ranging in size from 4 feet to 9 feet 2 inches. I had behavioral profiles on the 4 largest animals based on 7 years of observation. I had feeding pattern documentation, territorial boundary estimates, and seasonal activity logs. I knew this swamp the way a property owner who has spent 14 years paying attention to it knows it. Warren Gill did not know this swamp at all. Warren had been elected HOA president of Pinewood Lakes 8 months prior. Pinewood Lakes was the residential development on my western and southern boundaries, built 6 years ago on the upland sections of the former ranch property that my land had once been part of. 92 homes, a community lake, and Warren, who had retired from a career in event management and had brought to his HOA presidency the specific orientation of someone whose professional identity was built on producing memorable experiences for groups of people. He wanted to produce memorable experiences for the Pinewood Lakes community. He had identified my property as a resource for doing so. The first approach had been a letter, 6 months into his presidency, asking whether I would consider hosting a nature walk for community residents on my upland pine section. I had declined, politely, explaining that my property's conservation easement restricted organized group activities and that my wetland management protocols required limiting human presence near the swamp edge. Warren had responded with a second letter asking whether I would consider a modified nature walk limited to the upland section with professional ecological interpretation provided by himself, who described his relevant experience as having attended several ecotourism events during a vacation to Costa Rica. I had declined again. The third letter proposed a partnership in which the HOA would fund trail improvements on my upland section in exchange for resident access. I declined and explained again that the conservation easement restricted the modifications he was proposing. Warren had stopped sending letters after the third one. I had assumed the matter was resolved. It was not resolved. Warren had apparently decided that asking was producing the wrong result and that arranging was a more productive approach. He had sent a notice to Pinewood Lakes residents announcing a fall camping weekend on what the notice described as the natural conservation land adjacent to the development. The notice included a map showing the eastern section of my property. The notice did not mention that the land was private or that access had not been arranged with the owner. Diane Mellows had organized the event in good faith based on Warren's notice. 45 people had shown up in the pre-dawn darkness of a Saturday morning and started setting up camp 40 yards from 11 Alligators. I called Warren Gill at 6:15 in the morning. He answered with the voice of a man who had been asleep and was not happy about not being asleep. I told him who I was and what I was looking at. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Thomas, I can explain." I said, "Warren, there are 45 people on my land, including children. There are 11 alligators in the swamp edge 40 yards from where they were camping. I need you here in 20 minutes. He said, "Is everyone okay?" I said everyone was okay and needed to stay okay and that I needed him here. He arrived in 23 minutes, which told me he had driven fast. He walked up the access road to where the group was standing and looked at the tents still visible in the eastern section and looked at me. I said, "Walk with me." I took him to the swamp edge, not close, far enough to see the water and the cypress and the morning mist and Goliath, who had returned to his bank position and was visible as a dark shape in the gray light. Warren looked at Goliath for a long moment. He said, "That's a big alligator." I said, "He is 9 feet 2 inches and he has been resident in this section for 7 years. He was 40 yards from your camping group at 5:47 this morning." Warren said, "I didn't know about the alligators." I said, "Warren, this is Central Florida. There are always alligators near water. This is a managed wetland habitat. I have an active alligator management program. None of that was unknown information. It was your responsibility to know it before you put 45 people on this land." He said, "I should have asked you." I said, "Yes, you should have." He said, "I thought you would say no." I said, "I would have said no." He said, "I know." I looked at him for a moment. He said, "What do we do now?" I said, "We get 45 people safely off my property, then we deal with what comes after." The departure took about 90 minutes, which was the time required to break down 11 tents, pack a camp kitchen, and move 45 people and their equipment down the access road to the HOA's transport vehicles that were parked on the county road. I assisted with the logistics because getting people off an active wetland property efficiently was more important to me than standing apart from the situation. Diane Mellows came to me before she left. She said, "Mr. Greer, I want you to know that I had no idea this land wasn't authorized. Warren's event notice said the access was arranged." I told her I believed her and that my issue was not with her or the community residents. She said, "Are you going to do something about Warren?" I said I had already called my attorney. She said, "Good." She loaded her equipment into her car and drove away. I walked back to the swamp edge. Goliath was still on his bank. I stood there for a while in the morning light and thought about 14 years of managing this wetland and the specific weight of what had almost happened before I came through the tree line at 5:47. Then I called my attorney back and told her I was ready to talk about what came next. My attorney was a woman named Sandra Hewitt, who had practiced environmental and property law in Orlando for 22 years, and who had helped me structure the conservation easement on my property when I acquired it. She was familiar with my land, familiar with my management protocols, and when I called her at 6:15 on a Saturday morning, she answered on the third ring because she had the professional instinct of someone who understood that early morning calls from clients with wetland properties in Florida were worth answering. I gave her the full account. When I finished, she said, "Everyone is safe." I said everyone was safe. She said, "Document everything before you do anything else. Photographs of the camp set up in situ. Photographs of the swamp edge, your alligator observation log from this morning, and the timeline of when you arrived, when you moved the group, and when they departed." I said I was already doing the photographs. She said, "I need Warren's event notice. Do you have it?" I said Diane Mellows had given me a copy before she left. It was on HOA letterhead, signed by Warren as president, and described the eastern section of my property by reference to the development map, with a notation that said land access courtesy of Pinewood Lakes Conservation Partnership. Sandra was quiet for a moment. She said, "Courtesy of Pinewood Lakes Conservation Partnership." I said there was no such partnership. She said, "Warren invented a partnership to justify putting 45 people on private wetland property adjacent to an active alligator habitat." I said that was an accurate summary. She said, "Thomas, I need you to understand the full scope of what we are dealing with before you decide how to proceed." She explained. The unauthorized entry onto my property was trespass, straightforward and documented. The conservation easement on my property was a recorded legal instrument held by the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. Organized group activities on easement-restricted property without easement holder approval potentially constituted a violation of the easement terms, which were also the terms of my tax benefit arrangement. If the state determined that my property had been used in a manner inconsistent with the easement through my failure to prevent unauthorized access, there could be implications for the easement's standing. I had not considered that angle. Sandra said, "You acted correctly this morning. You discovered the intrusion and you ended it. The documentation of your response matters for protecting the easement." I said I understood. She said, "The alligator situation is the second layer. Florida has specific liability statutes regarding landowners and alligator incidents. You are protected by those statutes because you maintain an active management program and you have documentation of the management protocols. But the protection depends on the incident being the result of an unpredictable natural event rather than a foreseeable hazard you failed to warn about." I asked what that meant in practical terms. She said, "It means that your documented management program is evidence that you take the hazard seriously. It also means that Warren's decision to put campers on your land without notifying you or assessing the hazard is the foreseeable failure, not yours." I said I understood the distinction. She said, "I am going to contact the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission today to notify them of the unauthorized entry on the easement property and your response. That creates a federal and state record that protects your easement status." I said I appreciated that. She said, "And I am going to send Warren Gill a letter today, not Monday, today, because the documentation of immediate response matters." I said, "Please do." She also said, "Is there anyone in the Pinewood Lakes community who was not involved in Warren's decision and who you believe acted in good faith?" I said Diane Mellows had been completely forthcoming and had cooperated fully with the departure logistics. She said she may be useful. Sandra's letter to Warren went out by email at 9:47 that morning with a follow-up by certified mail. It was 6 pages. It described the unauthorized entry, the trespass on conservation easement restricted property, the alligator hazard and its documented nature, the false representation of a partnership in the event notice, and the potential liability exposure Warren had created for himself personally and for the HOA institutionally. It also included a formal demand for an immediate written acknowledgement that no access arrangement existed between Warren or the HOA and my property, a formal retraction of the event notice distributed to residents, and preservation of all communications related to the event planning. Warren retained an attorney by Monday afternoon. The attorney was a man named Philip Cross, who practiced HOA and community association law in the Orlando area and who called Sandra on Tuesday morning. Sandra described the call as the call of an attorney who had reviewed his client's situation over the weekend and had arrived at the conversation with a realistic assessment. Philip said his client understood that the event had been organized without proper authorization and that he was prepared to discuss resolution. Sandra said resolution began with the written acknowledgements she had demanded in her Saturday letter. Philip said his client was prepared to provide those. Sandra said there was a second matter. She explained the easement complication. The Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission had received her notification on Saturday and had responded Monday morning requesting documentation of the incident and my response protocols. The commission was conducting a review to confirm that the easement's terms had not been compromised by the unauthorized use. Philip was quiet for a moment. He said the state is involved. Sandra said the state held the easement and had been notified per standard protocol. Philip said, "What does your client need from the resolution to protect the easement status?" Sandra said the commission needed documentation of three things: that the unauthorized entry had been discovered and ended promptly, that the property owner had not authorized or facilitated the entry, and that appropriate corrective measures had been taken to prevent recurrence. She said the corrective measures portion was where the HOA's cooperation became relevant. Philip asked what corrective measures looked like. Sandra said the HOA needed to distribute a formal notice to all residents clarifying that my property was private conservation land with no community access arrangement of any kind, that the event notice had been issued without authorization, and that future communications about access to adjacent properties required verification with the property owner before distribution. Philip said that was embarrassing for his client. Sandra said it was considerably less embarrassing than the alternative, which was a state easement review, a federal wetland trespass filing, and a civil action covering trespass damages, easement interference, and the costs associated with the alligator incident response. Philip said he would discuss with his client. He called back Wednesday. Warren had agreed to all three acknowledgements and was prepared to issue the resident notice. Sandra said there was also the matter of damages. The damages claim covered 4 categories: my professional time responding to the incident, which I had documented at my standard ecological consulting rate for the 3.5 hours from my first contact with the group to the completion of the departure and swamp monitoring. The cost of the accelerated alligator monitoring I had conducted for the 2 weeks following the incident to confirm that the unusual activity had not altered territorial patterns, which it had not, but which needed to be documented. Legal costs for the Saturday through Wednesday response period. And a general damages component for the interference with my conservation management program and the easement-protected property. Sandra's total damages claim was $14,800. Philip came back with $8,000. Sandra said $12,000 was the floor given the easement complications. Philip came back with $10,500. Sandra said $11,000 with the full acknowledgement package and the resident notice. Philip accepted. The settlement was finalized the following week. Warren's written acknowledgement was recorded. The resident notice went out to all 92 Pinewood Lakes households on a Thursday. Diane Mellows called me after she received it to say she was sorry for her role in the situation, even though her role had been entirely in good faith. I told her she had nothing to apologize for and that her cooperation on the morning of the incident had been helpful and professional. She said, "Warren should have talked to you." I said, "Yes." She said, "He talked about you at HOA meetings, like you were a resource the community hadn't figured out how to access yet." I sat with that phrase for a moment. A resource the community hadn't figured out how to access yet. I said, "My property is a private conservation area. It is not a community resource." She said, "I know that now." The Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission completed its easement review 6 weeks after the incident. The review found that the unauthorized entry had been promptly discovered and ended, that the property owner had not authorized or facilitated the entry, and that the corrective measures implemented through the settlement were sufficient to satisfy the easement's protection requirements. The easement status was confirmed as intact. Sandra sent me the Commission's confirmation letter with a note that said, "Clean outcome, easement protected, good response protocol." I put the letter in my management files next to the Alligator survey records and the incident documentation from the Saturday morning. Warren resigned as HOA president 4 months after the settlement. I found out from Diane, who had been elected to the board in a special election and who called me to introduce herself in her new capacity and to confirm that the board's understanding of my property's status was clear and permanent. I told her I appreciated the call. She asked whether I would ever consider a formal ecological education arrangement with the community, the kind with proper documentation and limited access to the upland section only. I said I had a standard educational access agreement I used with county school groups, and that if the HOA wanted to propose something consistent with those terms, I would review it. She said she would put together a proposal. The proposal came in 6 months later. Diane had done her homework. It was consistent with my standard agreement terms, compensated at my educational rate, limited to the upland pine section with no access to the wetland margin, and included a liability waiver that my attorney reviewed and approved. We ran the first session in spring. 14 residents, 90 minutes, upland ecology focus, no swamp access. At the end of the session, one of the participants, a man named Gerald, who had been taking photographs the whole time, asked if we might be able to see the swamp from a distance. I said from the upland edge, briefly, with me present. We walked to the upland wetland transition, and I pointed out the cypress section from 150 yards. Goliath was on his bank. Visible, clear, 9 feet 2 inches of patience and prehistory sitting in the morning sun. Gerald said, "That is an enormous alligator." I said he had been resident in that section for 7 years. Gerald was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm glad we're standing here and not over there." I said I was glad of that too. We walked back to the upland section. I checked my management log that evening. 11 residents documented, territorial patterns stable, no anomalous behavior following the session. I added the session to the property's activity record and noted the observation of Goliath from the upland edge. The log was the same log I had been keeping for 14 years. The same format, the same notation system, the same careful record of what lived on this land and how it behaved, and what happened when human activity intersected with it. The log from the Saturday morning of the camping incident was in that same file. Time of first alligator observation, 5:43. Goliath position, swamp bank, 12 yards from nearest tent location. Response, human activity redirected, Goliath retreated to water at 5:51. All residents accounted for and relocated to access road by 6:19. 4 minutes and 36 lines of log notation that documented the difference between what happened and what could have happened. Documentation is like that. It is the record of what you saw and what you did and when, and its value is not always apparent until something requires it to be precise. On a Saturday morning in Central Florida, with 45 people between me and 11 alligators in the pre-dawn dark, the value of 14 years of documentation was very apparent. Here is what I will leave you with. Warren Gill looked at my property and saw an underutilized resource. He saw open land and cypress trees and what the development map described as conservation area adjacent to community, and he decided that adjacent meant available. He did not read the easement. He did not call me. He did not research what lived in the wetland or why I managed it the way I managed it. He sent 45 people into a pre-dawn wetland margin in Central Florida in October and called it a community event. I found out about it at 5:47. Goliath found out about it at approximately 5:43. The 4 minutes between those two moments are the reason this story has the ending it has. Know what lives on your land. Know where it lives and when it is active. Document it not because you expect a dispute, but because documentation is what land management is. The surveys, the logs, the behavioral records, they are not paperwork. They are the knowledge of the place, accumulated over time, that tells you what to do when something requires you to act quickly and correctly. That knowledge is what got 45 people safely to the access road before Goliath decided the camp kitchen was worth investigating. And it is what got the easement review closed in my favor 6 weeks later. Keep the logs. Know the land. And if you manage a wetland in Florida, know exactly where the 9-foot alligator is at 5:43 in the morning. Drop your thoughts below. If someone has treated your private property as a community resource without asking, tell me about it. And if you manage any kind of specialized land, whether wetland, wildlife habitat, agricultural, or otherwise, the documentation you maintain for management purposes is also the documentation that protects you when someone decides your land is available for uses you never authorized. The logs are the case. Keep them current. End of part 2, approximately 7,000 words. Thumbnail text. He sent 45 campers onto my land without asking. Goliath was already awake. Sonnet 4.6.